Here, folks, for today's lecture, we're just doing a brief introduction to the different market structures. So consider this just a taste of each one. We're going to be going into depth about each and every one of these. Um, so we will be going over this stuff a lot more later on. For now, this is just the basics to know. First of all, what do we mean by market structures? We mean how a product is supplied. So, what type of industry is it? And this doesn't mean like it's, manufacturing or service. This is a little bit different in terms of how the industry itself is structured, not necessarily the product that's being put out. So, there are four structures you have to know: perfect competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. So, there's a few basic ways to define which market structure you're in, and the two easiest questions that'll get you most of the way there is um, how many firms are there and what type of product. So, if there are a lot of firms, you're on the side of perfect competition and monopolistic competition. Uh, Oligopoly is kind of in the middle, but really it has very, very few firms, is the better way to think of it. Few. Monopoly, that's the easiest. There's one. Mono, one. Um, so that's the idea of firms. Uh, are products differentiated? Well, can you tell one firm's products from the other? That's the idea here. Can you tell my product from your product? If you can't, then they are not differentiated. If you can, then they are. Um, so for Monopoly, this doesn't really apply because they're the only ones producing it, so it doesn't matter. An oligopoly, they might be differentiated, they might not. It doesn't matter. Once again, this distinction matters much more when it comes down to perfect competition and monopolistic competition. It's really the main difference between the two. Perfect competitors have identical products. Monopolistic competitors have differentiated products. They're similar, but you can tell the difference. So let's get a little bit deeper into each of these. First of all, a perfect competitor lets you know that firms are price takers. And this is because there are many, many, many firms. So many that it's impossible for us to internalize it. That each individual firm has no actual impact on the market. Each individual purchaser has no impact on the market, and the products are identical. So for this reason, each individual firm can't raise or lower its price because they will all be at the lowest possible level to be able to survive. If they raise their price, somebody's going to go. Consumers are just going to go to the other firms. If they lower the price, well, now they're just losing money, and others will match them, and then they're losing money, and it's negative on the whole industry. They can't keep that up. So um, that's sort of the main parts. And there is free entry and exit from the market. It is absurdly easy to get into perfect competition and get out of perfect competition. So this is going to have effects in the long run because remember, entry and exit uh, to and from the market is a long run decision. You can't do it in the short run because it involves changing up your fixed inputs. Um, that being said, uh, does perfect competition exist in the real world? The answer is no. It's just a theoretical idea. We do have things that we use as close to versions of this, and agricultural products are normally the close to version that we go here. Um, your average person isn't going around to each individual farm and figuring out who has the best corn. Um, for the most part, we are not doing that, and agricultural products are vaguely perfect competition if we ignore the idea of industrial farming and all that stuff. So that's what we're doing here. Think like old school farming. Monopoly, this is the sort of easiest one to identify since there's one producer of the good. The good has no close substitutes. Um, if it had close substitutes, then they might actually be considered close to the same good. So that's the idea there. That doesn't come up too often on the AP test, though. So for monopolies, one producer, no close substitutes. There are usually very, very high barriers to entry. That's why there's only one producer. And that could be due to a few different reasons. You might have ownership of essential resources. If you're the only one who owns the diamond mine, well, then you're the monopolist there. Um, Economies of scale, so like very, very high setup costs. Um, Technological superiority. If you got that, then it's very hard to overcome it. Um, and sometimes the government creates those barriers. The government can help create a monopoly when it's in the public interest. And we'll get into that when we cover monopolies deeper. Oligopoly is probably the market structure that you're going to have the most fun with. It's the only one that we won't have to graph out. Um, we're going to look at it using something called game theory. So that look for that when it comes. Of course, that means it's a little bit more theoretical than pen to paper. Um, for an oligopoly, there are few large firms with market power. There might be some smaller ones, but they don't really matter. There are usually pretty high barriers to entry, and the firms are interdependent. What we mean by that is what one firm does has effects on the other one's profits. So a good way to think of this is actually what normally comes to mind with most of your products. If you think the soda market, the market for soda really has only a couple of large players. You have Pepsi and Coke, and a couple of other smaller ones that are large enough to have a difference. But you don't really have more than four that matter. That's an oligopoly. You only have a few. Now, what is the line that puts you from an oligopoly into a different market structure? There's no real answer there. Normally, we kind of put it at around 6, but that's just a moving target, really. Now, how do we figure out this market power? It is through two different types of calculations. The four firm concentration ratio, or CR4. Basically, all you do is just add up the market share of the four largest firms in the industry. And if it's very, very high, you got an oligopoly. If it's not, well, then you have a different type of market structure. There's also the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or the HHI. Essentially, you add up all the market shares, square it for all the firms in the industry, and this gives you an index, which is just an aggregate look at what's going on in the economy. Now, the higher the number, obviously, the more concentrated the market is. The lower the number, the less concentrated. Now, do you ever have to actually calculate those? No, not at all. Just know that they have to do with measuring market power. And the important part here is they really just tell how a firm behaves based on its market power. It's completely relative. Even in some oligopolies, you will have more dominant players in the structure than you do others. For instance, to bring it back to soda, who is more dominant, Coke or Pepsi? Well, it's going to be Coke. Now, Pepsi is a major player, but Coke is more dominant. Now, if Coke and Pepsi both decide to do something, what happens to your even smaller ones? What happens to Jones Soda? Well, I mean, obviously they have a lot less power in the market, so they're going to behave a little bit differently due to their market share. We don't have to get that deep, and actually, when we look at oligopolies, we're only going to be looking at a subset of oligopolies called duopolies, where there's only two firms in the market structure. Monopolistic competition. This is the market structure that gives people a little bit more trouble than others. For monopolistic competition, it's sort of like combining perfect competition and monopoly, thus the name. There are many firms, so not quite as many as perfect competition, but still a lot, more than you can typically think of. You do have a differentiated product, and I want you to think branding and sort of word of mouth recommendations. Some of the best examples of monopolistic competitors are small businesses. So think your local pizza place. That's going to be a monopolistic competitor. Uh, there are lots of small businesses. There are lots of local pizza places. Once again, not talking about the chains. So don't think about Pizza Hut. Don't think about Domino's or Papa John's or any of those. Think your corner greasy pizza place. That's a monopolistic competitor. Everything is basically the same, whether you go one place to another, but you can tell the difference. It's differentiated. I know what my favorite pizza place is. I'm assuming you do too, assuming you like pizza. But this lets you know the idea of monopolistic competitors. There's lots of them. They're all relatively the same, but you can definitely tell the difference. And there's also no barriers to entry or exit, or very low barriers to entry to exit. So firms are have it very easy to enter or exit the market, which will play into a long run portion of the monopolistic competitors.